Thank you for taking the time to watch this episode of Life Support. If you enjoy the content, we would ask that you like it, hit subscribe, and share it with your friends.
Well, I'm really honored to have Roger Thompson join us today. And Roger is a former lead pastor, but currently a teaching pastor at a large church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Welcome, first of all.
Thank you.
We want to tap into some of your wisdom that you've learned over the years of ministry and ministering not only to the congregation, but ministering to those that minister to the congregation. What are some of the lessons that you've learned? But first of all, a little bit about yourself. Tell us about where you're from, your family.
Yeah, I was born into a ministry family. Actually, I was born when my dad was starting seminary, and then he graduated, and his first church was in Golden, Colorado. So I grew up as a preacher's kid in the shadow of the mountains in Colorado, and later went to college in California. God called me into ministry and went to seminary at Denver Seminary in the early 70s, right in the middle of the Jesus movement, though I was not really a part of that aspect of it, but that was happening all around me. And I've pastored now in 3 churches, 2 in Denver and 1 here in Burnsville, Minnesota. So about 40-some years of pastoring.
All right, that's a few.
A few.
So when, now you mentioned the Jesus movement, and even before we get into some of this other stuff, the Jesus movement came out of a tumultuous situation in this country, right?
Yes.
I mean, really, so the 60s maybe we're playing a lot like we see today. Do you see any analogies?
I've seen, for the last several years, I've seen parallels. I'm sure historians would be more precise, but I was in college when the 1968 Democratic Convention, I think it was in Chicago, and there were riots. I remember Kent State, the shooting of students, the Vietnam protests, the whole struggle with the draft. I was on a Christian campus where some were coming home as veterans and going to college, and others were saying, no, I would never go in the Army. I'm resisting that. I'm a conscientious objector. So my early formative young adult years were in that Vietnam, and then the Jesus movement began, out of Calvary Chapel in California. I was in California at the time, and I met hitchhikers and other people who were, sanctified hippies and testifying for Jesus on the road, and then later when I got married in '71 and we moved to Denver, and there were many students at the local Bible college who had become Christ followers out of that movement. So it was a tumultuous time politically, but it was also a very fruitful time. I think most historians would agree it was a genuine revival. It really went across the country. And but it was wild. I mean, there was no structure. People were just doing stuff, starting communes, opening coffee houses, doing ministries, going on missions, and they had no support. They were, everything now is so buttoned down and locked down, but that was really a wild time.
Yeah, 50 years of marriage, by the way, congratulations.
Yeah,
that's
50 years.
Pretty amazing.
Yes.
Going back to your seminary days, what were you not taught in seminary that you wish you would have been taught, that you've learned over the years?
Well, I was never taught how to use a secretary. Didn't know I would ever have one. I was not taught a couple of realities about ministry. One was how to deal with conflict in ministry, and that's been difficult for me anyway, temperamentally, but I certainly was not trained in that way. It's interesting, my father and my father-in-law were both in ministries. They both had small churches, 200 people, 250 people, and they were shepherds. They shepherded their people. They were not great orators, but they were faithful teachers. When I went to seminary, my seminary was still fighting the old liberalism of the 40s and 50s. teaching me how to be a scholar and defend the text of Scripture against liberalism. And I remember, and these were fine men. I mean, I got a good, solid education there. But I remember thinking as a seminarian, I've never met a liberal. Show me one. How am I going to fight this battle? But I wasn't taught, I don't think the word leadership was ever used. I think it's overused today, and shepherding is underused as pastors, but I wasn't really taught how to lead or how to lead a team. I just had to learn that in the scrum of doing it and watching and making mistakes and making my own way. And I was very grounded in the languages, very grounded in theology, very grounded in those kinds of things, but not in the practical dimensions of ministry. But fortunately, my seminary years, I took 4 years to do 3 years of seminary. Fortunately, those years I was also vitally involved in a very fast-growing church. And so my practical informal internship and my formal term paper writing and theology studies really, it wasn't accidental from God's standpoint, but it was certainly from my planning. Those things blended together to give me a great leg up in ministry. And I'm very thankful for that. So.
A pastor that we have a great amount of respect for, Chuck Swindoll,
Yes.
has just recently come out and talked very candidly about some depression that his wife went through in the early years of their ministry when he was a pastor. And it was something they could never talk about. They had to do that in silence together. They had to suffer in silence, and that took its toll on the marriage.
Yeah.
Does that story, not with you personally, but does that ring true with your generation of pastors in the early years?
You know, I was always told as a pastor, you can't have friends in your church. And that has never been the case with us. There are many people we probably couldn't be friends with. Just they wouldn't understand our life. So I haven't felt like we have been distinct as, clergy. We've always had friends, although the older we've gotten, the more difficult that has become. When we were all up and coming, we were in our 20s and 30s, we were all making our households together and, planting lawns together and fixing cars together. It was easy for me to just be Roger with people. When I moved to Minnesota, I was about 41, I think, at that time. And both the Midwestern sort of deference to pastors and I think a little bit my age and the size of the church, I started being called Pastor Thompson. And I didn't really know how to handle that. I felt like that was such a distance, and but again, getting back to, I think there's always a struggle as a pastor knowing how transparent can I be. And a lot of that has to do with the culture, the leadership culture. It has to do with the trustworthiness or the trust that's been built with elders and the leadership of the church. And I've felt very fortunate that I've always had some safe haven in the churches that we've served. But I've also had some safe havens outside. So that has been very helpful.
And I want to talk about that line of transparency. We heard a young pastor recently say, when I was growing up watching, the pastors on TV, said, I didn't know anything about their personal lives. I didn't even know if they had kids, Right. So, and he's a young pastor now, probably in his 30s, of a large church. And I know that's a battle a lot of pastors face, where is that line? How much do you tell about your struggles from the platform?
Well, I think that I have been fairly, I would just say, open about my life and lifestyle I mean, people know a lot about my family. In fact, if I hadn't had small children when I first learned how to preach, I wouldn't have had any illustrations. You know how that is. People probably get tired of hearing about your kids. But I've talked a lot about my life outside of what they perceive me to being. But I'll share with you that I was on the board of a ministry that ministered to pastors and Christian leaders, and to give them counsel, often to work with them when they were in crisis or moral failure or whatever. And as I served on this board, the leader of the board turned to two of us who were there, and we were pastors on this board. And he said, you know, you guys who are pastors, you need to have a counseling intensive every 4 or 5 years. Because he said, you collect so much grunge in your spirit. You face so many traumas, so many hard things, so many threats, so many things that you haven't had a chance to process. And so my wife and I were about ready to go on a sabbatical, and we said, well, let's do that first. And frankly, we were exhausted as we were getting ready for this sabbatical. So we went for 4 days. And the intensive was, we would spend about 3 hours in the morning with the counselor, and all he would do is say, well, how's it going? And then he was very skilled, but as a listener, but you know, he didn't really ask us many questions. We just kind of splurged, and we thought, here's the issue, here's the pressure, here's what's really bothering us. And what we discovered was, no, it wasn't out there. It was right in here. And so one of the discoveries that I made was, Joanne, my wife, and I were talking one day, and I was describing our relationship to the counselor, and he said, Roger, you have a father-daughter relationship with your wife. I said, no, I don't. He said, yes, you do. I said, no, I don't. He said, Joanne, what do you think? She said, yeah, he does. So I was cornered. It was 2 against 1. My thought was, my thought was, no, a father-daughter thing is this domineering, demanding, austere man demanding things of his wife. And that is not me. But as Joanne described it through tears, she said, Roger, you are so self-sufficient. You don't ask anything of me. You don't say what kind of sandwich you want. You wouldn't ask me to go get the ketchup for you. You know, you are so self-sufficient that I wonder if you're here and I'm here, and I'm wondering, are we in an equal partnership in this marriage? And I was absolutely stunned by that, because my self-sufficiency in a sneaky way looked like servanthood. That I was serving her, not demanding anything of her. But I wasn't downstream from that, feeling the void that was leaving. That was such a huge revelation to me. And then the next revelation was, Roger, what you have in your marriage, you're reproducing in your staff. And I had heard that over and over and over again. And it sounds like a compliment, and it became a damning comment. Well, Roger, you don't need anything, because after all, you've got it all together. And it was that moment when my wife was willing to share with me how it felt living under my shadow, that things began to change. They're still changing, but I tell you that story because I've been able to share that kind of thing with the congregation. And I've had a host of men and couples identify with that, especially in this self-sufficient Minnesota culture. That's very true. I'm Scandinavian. It has a lot of Scandinavian stuff going on there. But not to blame any ethnic group at all, but that's me. And so that kind of thing I want to disclose, because it was such a learning for me, and it's not a shaming thing. It's because of the way my wife and I have worked on that. And it becomes a way for people to say, you know what, he's working on his stuff too. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't share junk. I think people can over-disclose. And But that type of thing, those life lessons, what I've learned about my anger, what I've learned, about my greediness, what I've learned about my introversion, I share those kinds of things as occasion, requires it from the pulpit and in smaller groups, and certainly with men's groups that I'm with. And so to me, that's been freeing that I can do it in that way.
So 2 follow-up questions to that. Number 1, does your wife get the ketchup now?
I still go get it. See, I was raised in a home where it said, basically, if you wanted the ketchup, well, you've got 2 feet, go get it yourself.
Yeah.
But anyway, no.
Well, you're the stoic
but no,
Scandinavian,
I
right?
deliberately ask her now,
Yeah.
would you make me a sandwich? Would you do this? Would you do that? And those sound like simple things, but it also then goes into me just being more transparent about my feelings and my emotions. Would you listen to me? Or I'd really rather not do that, or should we do this? So it leads into more things, yeah.
So how did that particular lesson from the counselor translate to your relationship with the staff? What was your first step with the staff?
I started asking competent people to do things that I couldn't do. Instead of me coming to a meeting and trying to have things mapped out and saying, let's do this, I started coming, basically it changed me from a leader who was trying to direct and implement to a leader who tried to find out what's the right question to ask. To this group of motivated, competent people. If I know what's the right question and what the right issue is, then say, how can we do this? And that has just flowered, in the staff's sense of calling and competence. And of course, I've been blessed because I used to leave every meeting with all the notes.
Yeah.
I had the do list. Everybody else went, hey, it was a nice meeting. And I would just go get busy. So I wish I had about 30 of my 45 years to do over again.
I was going to say, how far into your ministry years did this event take place?
It's still happening.
Yeah?
No, but I think it was probably about 20 years ago that I really turned that corner. And so I'd been in ministry quite a while up until then.
Does it get easier?
Ministry?
I mean, to
ask?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And it becomes much more kaleidoscopic almost. You ask something in the right way, and it's amazing to me with other gifted people how the colors change and you see new things. So
Yeah.
it's just much more of a discovery time. And I also think, though, that down beneath that is there's some work that I've needed to do on my identity. If my identity is solid in Christ, if I know whose son I am, and that he's not judging me by my competence, then it's easier, not easy, but easier to not have to feel like I'm competent all the time, but I'm seeking and wanting to know. And I think it also, in leadership, we read all the business books, about being transparent and being a team. But if the team never sees the leader be contradicted or changed, they're not going to trust that leader. But if you know what your identity is, you can give up some of those tightly held agendas that you have, or the great idea that you thought was going to really work.
Thank you. Roger Thompson, we share our stories here at Five Stone Media for the purpose of helping other people. And I know your story is going to do that for people that are watching. Yeah. And thank you for taking the time with us today.
You're welcome. It's my joy.
You have to do it again at some point.
All right. When I grow some more, you can.
There you go. All right.